Hi everyone, it's Plastic EP here from Melbourne, Australia. And today we're going to speak to a fantastic author and Beatle expert, Jim Berkenstadt, who's the author of this fantastic book, The Beatle That Vanished. And it's all about Jimmy Nicol, and just such a fantastic book. And I was the first person to buy it, by the way. How are you today, Jim?
Hey, I'm really good, Plastic EP. Can I call you Plastic since we're friends?
Yes, we're friends. You can call me Plastic. That's no worries. I'm glad you're doing that, Jim. Now,
it's great to see you.
You too, and you're looking fantastic there. You got really a good light setup, looking fantastic and sharp. Now, let's get into it. I'm going to ask you, how lucky was Jimmy Nicol to be chosen to go on the Beatles' first tour and be thrown into the eye of the hurricane, Beatlemania, in 1964? Talk about that. I'm just like intrigued.
Well, you know, what's interesting is I would say it was both luck and skill, because he was a very good drummer, both live and in studio sessions that he had started doing about 6 months before Brian Epstein and the Beatles picked him up. And so that was the skill part, the fact that he had the experience. He was a little bit older than the Beatles, and he had been on tours in Italy, all over the UK. And so he had the requisite experience. But in terms of luck, it's kind of interesting because Jimmy was not the first drummer chosen. He was actually the third drummer. The first two gentlemen, for different reasons, you know, mostly business related, turned it down and said, I can't get away right now, I'm too busy. One of them was Bobby Graham, who many people know was a session drummer for bands like the Kinks and other big British first wave bands of that time. And he stated in an interview that if he had gone on the tour, that he would have lost the opportunity for session work when he got back, because the guy that was called Charlie the Fixer would punish you if you missed even a few dates. He would put you all the way to the bottom of the list then. And session people made way more money than the average British person at the time, and so he couldn't give up that kind of money just for a short tour. So he suggested Jimmy Nicol, who he had seen in the studio and had seen playing live at clubs like the Flamingo in Soho. And so I'd say that's a little bit of luck that the two people were actually ahead of Jimmy, but he ended up getting the gig. So a little luck and a little skill and experience.
And George Martin recommended him to the Beatles. Is that right?
No. George Martin just made the phone call. I interviewed George Martin before he passed away while researching the book, because that's what everything on the internet said, was that George Martin recommended him. It was actually Bobby Graham, and I actually found footage of Jimmy Nicol in a studio session with Brian Epstein 2 months earlier. So Brian Epstein was familiar with Jimmy Nicol as well, because he was playing on one of Brian's other artists' records. But George Martin told me that while he had heard of Jimmy Nicol, that he had never produced him or seen him, and he explained that they were working at that time at different record labels and different studios. Jimmy was at Pi and Decca mostly as a session player. And of course, George Martin was at what we now call Abbey Road Studios, which was EMI at the time. So no, George Martin just made the phone call once it was decided that they were going to ask Jimmy Nicol to join.
See, there's a lot of myths. Like, now I'll ask you, okay, Ringo Starr's going to go in hospital for tonsillitis. That's correct. And they've got to find a replacement within a day. Is that right?
That's right. He collapsed at about noon, according to Neil Aspinall, who I talked to. And Neil, in fact, said, I remember carrying Ringo to the car to take him to the hospital. He was just very weak. And so, yeah, the very next day at 9 a.m., they were being taken to the airport. So that was 12 noon till 9 the next day. They did not even have 24 hours, really.
And then I got to say, then George turned around and said, I'm not touring. You can cancel the first tour because Ringo's not going to be playing and I'm not playing with anyone else. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. George said, you know, if Ringo's not here, we're not the Beatles. And if we're not the Beatles, I'm not going on tour. So, but there was a lot of pressure put on George to go along with the plan, because back then there were no out clauses in legal contracts for concerts, and promoters would have all over the world sued the Beatles. And there was all this merchandise on the shelves in each city. All the tickets would have had to be refunded. There would have been a lot of losses. And then just think about the public relations nightmare for Epstein and the Beatles for not showing up. So they basically had to explain all that to George and say, you know, our career might be over if we don't, you know, complete these obligations until Ringo can come back.
I got to say, because I live in Melbourne, Australia, it puts me in the box seat for this interview, because Ken Brosiak, the promoter, which was I believe he's a Melbourne promoter, right?
Yeah.
He got the Beatles at a bargain price when all they did is hold a piece of paper up and said, how many groups do you want from England? Right. And he circled the Beatles, and this is before they were known.
Yeah.
So he got them for a bargain price, and apparently they were committed. And when he met George Harrison, George said, you got us at the old price, didn't you? Right? I don't know if you heard that story.
I have heard that. That is a great sense. And George was always very he was always very on top of every dollar the Beatles were making. There was one point in time where I read that Mal Evans, George sent Mal Evans to the office one day to pick up all these contracts from one of the Beatle tours of America, because he wanted to see exactly what they made at each of those shows.
And when they came to Melbourne, I've got to say, they were given then a big reception at Melbourne Town Hall. And I've got to tell you, because I've got a relative who actually went to Lonsdale Street, and there was 100,000 people standing outside the Southern Cross when they came on the balcony with Jimmy Nicol and Ringo, because as you know, Ringo joined them here where I live.
That's right.
And that was an amazing thing. But compared to Adelaide, that was 300,000 people. That was on a different scale altogether.
Well, but you know, I've seen the town hall in Melbourne. I've been there, and also what I think the Southern Cross has been turned into an office building now. But
yeah, that's right.
It's amazing how so many people could have fit into those areas, because they're not that large. And when you see it on TV, just this mass of people in Melbourne, you think, wow, it must have been a very large area, but they must have been really packed in.
Well, I've seen the footage, and I was very small when it was live on television.
Yeah.
And their biggest fear was that the glass was going to collapse, the wall of glass of the hotel, because the kids were pressed up so up to it that they thought they were going to have a disaster. And that is a fact. And I think they grabbed this Christopher something medal as Ringo went into the hotel.
Right.
And then he had to have an appeal to get that back. And actually, the person who grabbed it off his neck, she came forward later and gave it to him.
Yeah, I remember that. That was nice.
That's a big story. Now, let's go into this tour that they did with Jimmy Nicol. I mean, I've seen Jimmy Nicol play. And I mean, to me, when I'm looking at stage, he doesn't look like Ringo. Let's face it, because of the size. Yeah. And they made him fit into the outfit. And he said, I just fit into his clothes. There was no time to get him clothes.
He's a husky guy, and Ringo was much more slender. Yeah.
Yeah, well, speaking husky, you know you put the single out husky, don't you?
I do, yes. That's one of his big solo hits.
Exactly. So what I'm saying is he was known for coming to Australia, and basically he liked to go off at night and go to clubs and have that freedom.
Yeah.
And the Beatles camp weren't too happy with how he wanted to do that. They wanted to keep him cocooned in his hotel room. Is that true?
Well, that was true when Brian Epstein came back in Melbourne. If you go back to Sydney, which was really an off night, because the first time they came to Sydney, it was just a stopover before going to Adelaide. And so they had the night free, but the Beatles always liked to hole up in their rooms because mainly they knew that they would be recognized and couldn't go anywhere. It was different for Jimmy Nicol because he could go anywhere he wanted and no one would know he's part of the Beatles. However, he went off with Mal Evans to a club in Sydney called the Checkers, which is still, it's now a spa massage palace, but they still have the sign and still down the steps where the club used to be. But they went there, and an American Capitol Records artist named Frances Faye was having a couple weeks there. And so she somehow found out he was in the audience, so she called him up and he played drums with her, and everybody applauded because she said, "I've got one of the Beatles here." But when they got to Melbourne, that's when Brian came back, and that's when, you know, he was much more strict. And he said, "Just pack your bags, Jimmy, and we're gonna, you know, you're done, and we'll take you to the airport tomorrow." And Jimmy was a very independent guy, and he didn't like being told that. So, and also Jimmy had sort of disrupted the very last press conference when all 5 of them were there when Ringo returned, because he was taking side interviews which you could hear and which sort of disrupted the questioning and answering of the other Beatles. So Epstein let him have it and was very upset with him about that and said, "Just go to your room, you know, and pack." So Jimmy packed, but then he scooted out to a bar, and then Neil Aspinall and I can't remember, it was probably Mal or somebody, had to both go out and retrieve Jimmy. And he said, "Well, why can't I drink in the bar?" And they said, "Because you're a Beatle, and until you leave, we have to take care of you, make sure everything's okay." And he says, "Well, I'm not a Beatle anymore." And they said, "You are a Beatle until we put you on that plane." And so, you know, they were just following Epstein's orders, and he came back, and, you know, and the Beatles by then were in full party mode, and then later were asleep when he actually left for the airport.
I was just going to say, first of all, I read your book. It's like an encyclopedia. Not only read it once, but read it 3 times.
Wow.
Because if you don't read it, you don't know. So,
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people can think they know what happened, but they don't actually know. I mean, I live in Melbourne, and at least I got some idea after reading the book.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they played at Festival Hall in West Melbourne.
Oh.
As I said, the Beatles had their parties, but they were private. Jimmy wasn't part of the parties.
Right.
So, I mean, that's not very good for him. I know how you'd feel. You'd be left out. These people are like king of the world now, 1964. Every newspaper or magazine, you can't open it up without pictures of the Beatles. So they're at their height.
Well, he did go to some of those hotel parties. He wasn't excluded. It's just that I think after that, you know, that back and forth with Epstein that night or that afternoon, I just think he didn't feel like being there, because he said once Ringo came back, it was like they closed ranks and they were brothers again, and he felt like an outsider at that point. But I'm sure he could have hung out at that party if he had wanted to.
Okay, I appreciate that completely.
What's that?
I appreciate that. Mm-hmm. And also I want to say, he said from the minute he put the suit on, he was transformed and he was mobbed by girls.
Yeah.
Like, and then after he took the suit off, it was like, no one wants to know him.
Well, and I think that is one of the appeals of that I found from spending 7 years researching this book, is that he was relatively unknown climbing the ladder in the late 50s and early 60s with various rock bands and rhythm and blues and even big bands that were still around at the time. Then he has this 2-week experience with the Beatles, which, you know, it's like one day no one looks at you, the next day they're tearing your clothes off. And then you're back to being an everyday person again after that. So I found that to be a very interesting dynamic, and how must that affect you when you have that famous line, that 15 minutes of fame and then it's over for the rest of your life. You've reached your high point at age 25. What do you do?
Well, that's right. But you know what? After an experience like that, you never go back to it. You can never climb that mountain again. That's the problem.
And he did try to do that, I think, with his solo career. He thought, well, I've seen how this works. I can be as good as the Beatles or better. I'll just pick a really good band. And, of course, that was sort of ego talking and pretty fanciful to think that.
Yeah, I just want to say that photo of him being sent to the airport, right? He's sitting in Essendon Airport.
Yeah.
Now, I've been in that lounge.
Yeah, me too.
That area now, those hangars and all that lounge, it's been transformed into like shops. That's what it is now. They've got like big, giant shops there.
Okay.
I actually went to Essendon Airport before it stopped being Essendon Airport. And I can tell you, I actually stood in that area where all those chairs were as a child. So, I mean, I know because I stood there. And that photo of him being by himself and that photo being taken in the local paper and then going out to the world.
Yep.
I mean, you look at that photo and you're mobbed by crowds before, and now you're just a lonely soul just sitting on a chair waiting to go home. And I've been told that they gave him £500 and a watch. Is that right?
Well, they definitely gave him a watch engraved from Epstein and the Beatles. As to the amount of money, there's been differing amounts mentioned over the time. Jimmy Nichols inflated the number, perhaps. Other people have deflated the number. Unless we were to, visit Apple and look and see if they have the old contract, I don't think anybody can say for sure. But they did give him a really nice gold watch, and it's very interesting. I did find out some interesting information about that gold watch once he moved to Mexico, and then when he moved again back to England. So the watch has an interesting history all of its own.
I've got to ask you now. We move away from it now. It goes back to the UK. The Beatles carry on. Now, we've got to ask ourselves, what happened to Jimmy Nicol from there?
From there?
Yep.
He formed a band. He had sort of already formed a band, but it was mostly studio work, called Jimmy Nicol and the Shub Dubs.
Yep.
And I would say that you should not name your band the Shub Dubs if you want to be bigger than the Beatles. But he did, nevertheless. Okay. And they were made up of fellow studio musicians. And because again, these guys made a lot of money in the studio at the time. He had to promise them a pretty high rate in order for them to come along and tour with him as Jimmy Nicol and the Shub Dubs, and they went on Top of the Pops, and they had to tour England, and then I think they went to back to Denmark. So that was all well and good while the glow of the Beatles was still on Jimmy Nicol. But what happens is, once the newspapers stop writing about you, and that all fades away, then the amount of people that come to see you at these shows gets smaller and smaller. Their first gig was to replace the Dave Clark 5 band on the top of a bill for a 2-week run. And so obviously they had huge crowds and they were paid very well for taking the place of Dave Clark 5's band. But as they started to plan their own gigs, they just got smaller as the whole, Beatle glow sort of wore off. So he tried another band called The Sound of Jimmy Nicol in the start of 1965. And again, he put out some singles, maybe didn't choose the right side of the single. And again, he had expensive studio musicians helping him, and he just couldn't get any real momentum going. So in roughly June or July of 1965, he was bankrupt. His wife had divorced him. He was completely out of work. Paul McCartney heard about that because it became a newspaper story. You know, the newspapers unfortunately always like to cover the rise and the fall of people who are famous. And so Paul heard about this, and he called Peter Asher, and Peter and Gordon hired him to do some studio work. I interviewed both of them, and also some live work, and you know, just to kind of get by. And Georgie Fame let him come back and play a few gigs with his band, even though he had left Georgie Fame in the lurch by going off with the Beatles and then not coming back to him after the Beatles. And then one day he just walked out the door, didn't tell anybody, because I interviewed lots of people who knew him before the Beatles. They had not seen him since that day in 1965. He walked out the door and disappeared. He vanished, just like the title, The Beatle Who Vanished.
Whoa. Now I got to ask you the big question, Jim.
Yes.
I know, because a lot of Beatle fans have asked me.
Yes.
So it's a two-part question. As soon as you finished the book, where was Jimmy Nicol at that time? And now it's 2020. Where is Jimmy Nicol now?
Well, at the time I finished the book, that was around 2011 or 12. Actually, a friend of mine suggested you should go over to London, find out where he lives, and go knock on his door, you know, and finish the book by interviewing him. And I said, that's a great idea. So I did that. And in fact, I even contacted one of his old musical friends, and we were going to go over there together. Unfortunately, the friend hurt his leg and couldn't go, but I went I found his apartment. It was the one, actually I hired a private detective in England or something to find it. And then I went there, knocked on the door, and there was a young man there in his probably mid-20s, and he was holding a baby. And I said, is Jimmy Nicol here? And he said, no, there's no Jimmy Nicol that lives here. We're fairly new renters. And so what had happened was he had a 100-year lease, which is sort of like owning an apartment. And he had hired a manager to sublet it to someone else. And then I called back the detectives, and I let them know that. And they did some more computer research and found that his pension, British pension, whatever it's called there, we call it Social Security here, was being sent out of the country. So they could actually see a bank transfer, but they could not tell where it was going. So it looks like I just missed him by 6 to 12 months. I don't know where he had gone at that time, because the private detective wanted $10,000 to find out where he was, and I didn't know whether they would even find out. And that's a lot of money, you know, when the book only costs $20 a piece. So I turned that offer down. But then, let's see, probably around 2015 or 16, we went to Edinburgh, Scotland, where I ran into Jimmie's cousin. And Jimmie's cousin just said, I believe, I'm not sure. He says, I'm the only one that stayed in contact with him over the years. And he showed me postcards and letters with dates on them, and it was clearly Jimmie's handwriting, and the postcards Jimmie had customized and shown him with the different bands that I discovered he played with after he vanished, such as the Spotniks and some Mexican bands. He said, I think Jimmie has gone back to Mexico. So last year, so 2019, I was working on a new chapter for a second edition of the book, and I hired a private investigator who's he's written books on how to disappear, and so then he supposedly knows how to find people who've disappeared. And I gave him as much information as I got from Jimmie's cousin and that I had developed on my own. And he tried everything, but he could not find Jimmie. I contacted Jimmie's ex-wife from Mexico, Julia, and she asked around to all the creative people that, you know, they were in this creative group together, and none of the people had seen nor heard of Jimmy. So as of right now, we don't know where Jimmy Nicol is.
Okay. Now, I've got to ask you, you got something special you want to show me and all the viewers and all the Beatle people. Yeah.
Right.
Let's have a look at that.
All right. So this is the concert set list that Jimmy Nicol used the first night of the first show of the first ever Beatles World Tour in Denmark. And let's see.
That's great. That's coming up great.
Is that good?
Yeah, if you come a bit closer, exactly like that, we might see the set list. Keep coming and just lift it up a bit.
Okay.
Yeah, bring it in, bring it in.
Bring
and
it
up. Bring it in and up.
Okay.
Yeah.
I can't really see because it's over my eyes.
No, that's fine. Don't worry.
Okay.
And the photos there, that's the photos from the concert, yeah?
So, yeah, and there's photos from the concert, which I think are over here. And what happened was John Lennon determined the set list, and he dictated it to Neil Aspinall, who had a little pen and paper and red ink. And red ink was kind of unusual to be using back in 1964. But,
Jim, can I just get you to read out the set list? Just actually read it?
Sure.
Please? Thanks.
It's, do you want me to read it as he wrote it?
Yeah, as he wrote it.
Yeah, he wrote standing there. I saw her standing there. Hold your hand. All my loving. She loves you. Till there was you. Beethoven. Can't buy me love. This boy. Twist and shout. And Long Tall Sally. Not a very long concert.
Fantastic. I really appreciate you showing that and reading it out.
Sure. So Neil wrote it out, and then he handed it back to John. And backstage, the drummer for the warm-up band called the Hitmakers, the drummer for them was called Torben Sordorf, and he was from Denmark and still is. And he saw Lennon hand it to Jimmy Nicol, so he kind of kept his eye on it, because he thought this could be a nice keepsake, and he knew that most bands just toss it on the floor after a show and it gets swept up. So Jimmy went on stage and put it on the top of Ringo's bass drum, and that way he knew what songs they were going to play and in what order. After the two shows were done and everybody was leaving, Mal Evans was packing up all of Ringo's drums, and Torben walked over, and this set list was just on the floor, and he just picked it up, and he kept it for many, many years. And eventually he sold it to me. But at the time, he thought it was written by John Lennon because he had seen John Lennon hand it directly to Jimmy Nicol. But he hadn't actually seen John Lennon write it out, but he assumed that John Lennon had written it. When I met with Neil Aspinall at the premiere of the Cirque du Soleil Love Show, which is in Las Vegas, we were at the premiere, and I was just hanging around the lobby and ran into Neil. I brought a color copy of that with me, and I said, Neil, this doesn't look like John Lennon's handwriting. Whose is it? And he goes, oh, that's me. He says, I wrote that one out. And he said, wow, where'd you get that? So, I told him the story. He said, amazing that any of those have survived, because, that was just stuff that would go in the garbage. So very nice keepsake.
I got to ask you now, where can they get the book? I want everyone to go out there and buy the book. So where's it available?
They can buy the book at Amazon.com. And I don't know, it's probably called something a little different in Australia, but anywhere in the world, if you go to actually my book website, which is thebeatlewhovanished.com, there is a tab there for each Amazon all around the world. So whatever country you're in, you just click on Amazon Australia, Amazon Spain, etc. Also, the other way it's available is directly from me. If people want signed copies, they can go to that website and click the tab for the autographed copy, and then it takes them to PayPal, and then I get the order, sign the book, and if they want it personalized, I'll do that, and then I ship it out to them.
Now, I've got to ask you, Jim, since you're calling me Plastic, I'll just call you Jay. Okay.
Sounds good, Plastic.
Thank you. Tell me now about the new book. I've got to have the exclusive on the new book.
Yes.
Which is about rock and roll mystery. So take your time and tell us when it's coming out, when they can get it, and what's it about.
Sure. Well, right now, because of the virus, a lot of publishing companies are working from home or not at all. So I'm waiting until this, sort of lets up so that I can shop it around to various publishers. If they're not interested, I'll just self-publish like I did for The Beatle Who Vanished. And so this is the actual manuscript, and it says Rock and Roll Detective presents Mysteries in the Music, Case Closed. And this book is a collection of chapters where each chapter is a different rock and roll mystery that no one has ever really gotten to the bottom of what happened. And so I'll give you some examples. One chapter is Who Really Discovered Elvis Presley? A lot of people think it was just Sam Phillips. Another chapter is another chapter is Did the CIA kill Bob Marley? And I actually interview CIA agents from the 70s and talk to people who were there. Another chapter is probably my favorite chapter is Did the Beach Boys steal a song from Charles Manson? Now, if you look that up on Google, you'll see millions and millions of stories. You'll see Manson saying they stole this song from me. But I actually found the only living witness to the transaction over that song. And he's actually in hiding somewhat because he doesn't want to. He just, after being involved with Manson directly back in those days, he just doesn't want anyone knowing where he is. But it took, it was an interesting route where I talked to a producer who then put me in touch with a very famous drummer who knew this guy personally and gave me his phone number. And the guy was very surprised to get a call. And then I said, it's okay, I'm not with the media or anything. I'm writing this book. Here's what it's about. And, you're the only person left on earth who was sitting in the room with Dennis Wilson and Charles Manson when this took place. But even then, there's a long and winding, twisting story behind this song and how it was created and who owns the rights to what. So there's even a whole legal section explaining who owns the rights. So each chapter is a different mystery, and it's a lot of fun. And people will learn a lot, but also enjoy it because it's a lot of bands that we're all familiar with.
Now, I've got to ask you, a lot of people, I don't think they know about this new film that's coming out.
Yeah.
Right? And it's produced by a few people, you'll tell me.
Sure.
But Roy Orbison's son is one of the producers, and that's based on your book, The Beatle Who Vanished. That's correct?
Yes. So Roy Orbison's son, Alex Orbison, and another gentleman named Ashley Hamilton, who's the son of actor George Hamilton, and who's at one time his stepdad was Rod Stewart. Two of the nicest guys you ever want to meet. They bought the film rights to my book, and then we made a deal with a film company in England called ECOS. And some people may be familiar with a movie they did about the Beatles before called Nowhere Boy, which is about John Lennon as a youth growing up, and it takes you just to the point where the Beatles become famous. Very nice movie. So they're going to produce this film. I'm also a producer on the film, and I'm working currently with the screenwriter, and I would say all I can tell you is the film is in development, and once the script is done, usually the next step is to create a budget, hire director, casting people, and then the casting people hire actors, and then they go out and look at locations. that's pretty much the route for this type of film. It's a full rock and roll bio picture, and it'll be available around the world, and it should be a lot of fun.
Jim, I got to tell you now, when the second book comes out, I want to be the first one to buy it.
All right.
Plus, I want to buy another copy of The Beatle Who Vanished, so you can sign two copies to your friend Plastic.
That would be great, Plastic. Very good. I would be happy to do that, and I will definitely send you a message once there's a publishing deal in place and the book. Then I'll know more about when the book can come out. So it should be a lot of fun.
Jim Berkenstadt, I can't thank you enough for a great interview, and believe me, it was great. I just know because I'm watching from here. So,
thanks so much, Plastic.
Plastic, thank you.
Thank
so
you.
I was going to say, from Plastic EP and Jim Berkenstadt, take us out, Jim, and say goodbye to everyone, and thank you again for a great interview.
Goodbye, everyone, and I hope that you enjoyed the interview, and if you're interested in The Beatle Who Vanished, come to the website, send me an email, or I'm available all over the place, Facebook, Twitter, etc., usually under the name Rock and Roll Detective. So thanks again, and thanks to Plastic for the great interview.
Thank you again, Jim. I'm just going to call you Jay from now on for the next interview. Okay.
Sounds good.